In the outskirts of Vienna, the Lainz General Hospital stood as a massive monument to modern medicine and care. Within its walls, Pavilion V was dedicated to the elderly and the terminally ill, a place where life was meant to fade with dignity and professional support. During the 1980s, a dark and functional system of malice began to operate in the dead of night. For nurses, led by the commanding Waltraud Wagner, turned the ward into a private kingdom of life and death. They developed a horrific method of execution that left no physical marks, a technique they clinically called the water cure. For 6 years, the sounds of struggling patients were ignored by a hospital system that was too overwhelmed to notice. Let's go deep into the well. Waltraud Wagner was the functional leader and the primary architect of the group. She was a professional nurse who had worked at the Lainz Hospital for years, gaining a reputation for extreme efficiency and a strict, almost military control over her shifts. She was a woman who demanded total obedience from her subordinates, and she found 3 willing accomplices in Stefanija Mayer, Maria Gruber, and Irene Leidolf. Together, they formed a closed circle of power within the walls of Pavilion V. Wagner's psychological profile showed a profound need for dominance and a deep-seated resentment toward the patients she was supposed to care for. She viewed the elderly and the infirm not as human beings with stories and families, but as biological burdens that needed to be managed or eliminated. This was not a sudden break from reality, but a slow, professional erosion of empathy that occurred over years of working in a high-pressure environment. She began to experiment with ways to exert the ultimate control over those who were too weak to resist her. She eventually discovered a method that was as simple as it was brutal, realizing that she could dictate who lived and who died without ever leaving a trace on a medical chart or attracting the attention of the daytime staff. Waltraud Wagner transformed the ward into her own laboratory of death, where she played the role of a dark goddess. The group methods began with the misuse of medication and high doses of morphine, but they soon developed a more specific and terrifying technique that allowed them to kill without using hospital supplies. Wagner discovered that by forcing large amounts of water into a patient's lungs, she could induce a death that appeared to be natural pulmonary edema to any casual observer. This was the functional origin of the water cure. It was a professional execution carried out with the common tools of the trade. They would select a victim, often someone who was perceived as difficult, someone who complained too much, or someone who simply required more care than they were willing to give. One nurse would use her weight to hold the struggling patient down while another would pour water into their mouth and nose. The death was agonizing, slow, and loud, yet it took place in a ward where the sounds of suffering were so common they were simply filtered out by the rest of the exhausted staff. The water cure was a perfect, invisible weapon because it left the lungs filled with fluid, a condition that was frequently seen in elderly patients dying of natural causes. It left no bruises, no needle marks, and no chemical traces. For several years, the group operated with total impunity, growing bolder with every life they extinguished. They developed a shared language and a series of twisted rituals surrounding their nightly crimes. They would often celebrate a successful execution with drinks in the staff room, treating the deaths of their patients as a professional accomplishment or a successful cleaning of the ward. Waltraud Wagner was the one who decided the nightly quota, often telling her accomplices that a specific patient needed to go because their presence was making the shift too difficult. The functional goal was to reduce the workload and to satisfy Wagner's insatiable craving for power over the helpless. The hospital administration at Lainz was focused on strict budgets and maintaining high turnover rates, creating a professional environment where sudden deaths among the elderly were not questioned as long as the paperwork was in order. The nurses became so confident in their invisibility that they stopped being cautious. They began to joke about their power in front of other staff members and even in local bars, believing that the wall of silence they had built within the isolated corridors of Pavilion V was unbreakable. They were the undisputed masters of a closed system, and the victims were powerless to stop the rising tide that was systematically being forced into their own lungs. The scale of the killings was staggering and remains difficult for the public to fully comprehend. While the official investigation eventually linked the group to 49 specific murders, Waltraud Wagner later boasted in private that the real number was closer to 200. This would make them some of the most prolific and lethal serial killers in the history of Austria. The functional deception was maintained by the nurses' ability to mimic a professional and caring demeanor during the daytime hours when supervisors were present. They were seen as hard-working, dedicated individuals who were willing to handle the most difficult and depressing ward in the entire hospital. This stark contrast between their public persona and their private malice is what allowed the tragedy to continue for 6 years without interruption. They exploited the deep trust inherent in the medical profession, using their white uniforms as a shield against any form of suspicion or scrutiny. The patients who managed to survive their shifts lived in a state of constant, silent terror, sensing the dark energy of the nurses but unable to communicate their fears to the doctors or their visiting families. Pavilion V had become a factory of death, and the machinery was running at full capacity under the watchful eye of Waltraud Wagner. The end of the group's reign of terror came in early 1989, and it resulted from a moment of incredible professional carelessness born of overconfidence. The 4 nurses were sitting in a local tavern near the hospital, drinking heavily and laughing loudly about their recent activities. They were specifically discussing the death of a certain patient and the functional success they had achieved with the water cure method. A doctor sitting at a nearby table overheard their conversation and was deeply horrified by the clinical and casual way they spoke about the mechanics of killing. He reported the incident to the hospital authorities the following morning, who were finally forced to take action after years of looking the other way. A secret investigation was launched, and the police began a meticulous review of the death certificates and medical records of Pavilion V. They found an impossible and statistically significant cluster of deaths that occurred only during the shifts worked by Waltraud Wagner and her team. The professional veneer was finally stripped away by investigators, and the police moved in to arrest the 4 women in April of that year. The news of the angel makers of Lainz sent a massive shockwave through the city of Vienna, as the public realized that the most vulnerable members of society had been hunted like animals. The interrogation of the 4 nurses was a descent into a cold, psychological void that tested the resolve of the investigators. Waltraud Wagner was the first to speak, and she did so with a chilling lack of remorse that stunned the detectives. She described the water cure in graphic detail, explaining the functional mechanics of how they killed and the criteria they used to choose their victims. She spoke as if she had been performing a necessary public service, clearing out the beds for those who had a better chance of recovery or simply ending lives she deemed worthless. Her accomplices followed suit, each trying to shift the primary blame onto Wagner's dominant personality while admitting to their own active roles in the massacre. They described a ward where the rules of common humanity had been replaced by a toxic and sadistic power dynamic. To these nurses, the patients were just objects in a professional space that needed to be cleaned or removed. The confession revealed a system of malice that had become a routine and accepted part of their daily lives, as common as taking a pulse or changing a dirty bandage in the middle of the night. The trial of the Lainz nurses became one of the most publicized and controversial legal events in Austrian history. The courtroom was constantly filled with the grieving families of the victims, seeking any kind of answer for the sudden and suspicious deaths of their loved ones. The professional defense team tried to argue that the nurses were victims of an impossible system, that they were overworked and stressed to the point of a mental break. They claimed the women suffered from a unique form of burnout that led to their actions. The prosecution presented the evidence of the water cure as a calculated, deliberate, and sadistic practice. They showed through witness testimony and confessions that the nurses had actually enjoyed the suffering of their victims and had used death as a tool for their own workplace convenience and amusement. Waltraud Wagner was portrayed as the dominant and corrupting force, a woman who had used her seniority to turn her younger colleagues into killers. The trial exposed not just the horrific crimes of 4 individual women, but a massive and systemic failure in the hospital's professional oversight and administrative ethics. It was a dark story of how a total lack of accountability can allow a small group of predators to take over an entire institution from within. In 1991, the final verdicts were handed down in a courtroom heavy with emotion. Waltraud Wagner and Irene Leidolf were sentenced to life in prison for their primary roles in the murders, while the other 2 received long sentences for their involvement. The judge described their actions as the most horrific and unforgivable abuse of the nursing profession imaginable. The story did not end with the sentencing of the group. In a move that sparked renewed and intense public outrage across the country, Waltraud Wagner was released from prison in 2008 for good behavior, having served less than 20 years for her role in what many believe were hundreds of deaths. She was given a new identity by the state and allowed to live in total anonymity, far away from the families she had devastated. This functional erasure of her past felt like a final, crushing insult to the memories of the victims. The woman who had dictated the lives and deaths of so many was given a second chance at a quiet life, while her victims remained in the silent graves of the Vienna Central Cemetery. The release of the angel makers remains one of the most controversial chapters in the Austrian justice system, a reminder that the law often struggles to match the scale of such profound and calculated human malice. Pavilion V at the Lainz Hospital is no longer in operation, and the entire institution has been renamed and restructured to distance itself from the tragedy. But the shadow of the water cure remains a permanent part of the city's dark history and medical lore. The case of Waltraud Wagner is studied today by medical professionals around the world as the ultimate warning of what happens when empathy is replaced by a professional desire for control and convenience. The victims were the forgotten members of society, the ones whose voices were too weak and whose lives were deemed too small to be heard over the sound of the rising water in their lungs. Their story is a deep journey into a system that failed at every single level, from the nurse's station to the highest administrator's office. The story of the Lainz nurses is a record of how easily a place of healing can be turned into a house of horrors when no one is watching. Waltraud Wagner used her professional skills to become a judge and an executioner, proving that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones wearing a uniform of trust. Subscribe, ring the bell, and thanks for watching. Don't forget. I will see you at the bottom of the well.